The Killer Bee True Crime Podcast, Episode 6, Part 2. Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. Ed Kemper felt isolated and incompetent, detached from other people around him, and he searched for a place where he could feel powerful and in control. He lived most of his life in his imaginary, vicious world. That's where he could live out his darkest and most deranged fantasies. He dreamed of raping and killing women, dismembering their corpses. His rage, simmering, egged on by his controlling and abusive mother. The hatred for his mother consumed him. His every thought longed for her death, and he wanted it to be in his own hands. Finally, when his twisted daydreams became too much to resist, Ed Kemper's violent fantasies became Santa Cruz's horrific reality. Ed Kemper killed his first victims, his own grandparents, at age 15, August 27, 1964. He later killed 8 women between 1972 and 1973. He would kill and dismember female hitchhikers in Santa Cruz, California. He became most famous for killing his own mother, and for the lengthy interviews he did with the FBI. They played a significant role in developing the FBI's serial killer profiling system. At 21, he'd tricked the psychiatrist into believing that he was cured, and he was released from the psychiatric hospital. On December 18, 1969, Ed moved back in with his mother, the one place they told the housing authority not to let him go. They did get along for a short while. Ed enrolled in a local community college in order to pursue a career in law enforcement. Ed craved structure. He wanted to instill that structure in the world. After months of hard work, he applied to the police academy. They rejected his application. Ed thought it was because of the double homicide he'd committed and his incarceration, but it was actually because of his height. He was 6'9", 4 inches taller than the required height limit. Author's note: there are no height limits in today's police academies. They're deemed discriminatory. Ed had been mocked because of his height his entire life. He internalized it throughout his youth. He had endured the bullying from his peers, and now he was being rejected once again for his height. This was deeply upsetting. A study entitled "Does Rejection Hurt?" looked at brain scans during social exclusions. It found that activity in certain parts of the brain paralleled the activity of the brain where the person felt actual pain. Ed Kemper could have confused this as physical pain. Ed felt resentment and hatred for those around him, and he was crushed when his only goal in life wouldn't be coming true. Everything his mother said about him being useless, everything his classmates mocked him about, Ed drew further and further into his fantasy world, where he could extract bloody vengeance against all who had wronged him. He had become consumed with his hatred for his mother. All the psychological progress he had made at Atascadero was slipping away. Ed states, quote, "My mother and I started right in on horrendous battles. Just horrible battles, violent and vicious. I've never been in such vicious verbal battles with anyone," end quote. However, Ed wasn't ready to act on that rage just yet. He'd continue to try to live a normal life. He got a job with the state of California Highway Department, working road construction. Ironically, this was the same job his grandfather had worked before he retired. In a way, Ed felt like he was carrying on his grandfather's legacy. He enjoyed the work. His massive size was actually put to good use when it came to manual labor. He also found a way to get close to law enforcement. After work, he became a regular at the Jury Room, a bar in Santa Cruz. It was just down the street from the county courthouse, and because of its location, the bar was frequented by police officers. Ed used the charm he had learned in Atascadero to ingratiate himself with the local police. He became a friendly nuisance and pestered them about work. The cops soon began to enjoy his presence, and they gave him the nickname Big Ed. They told him all sorts of stories about their work, not realizing that Ed was absorbing all that info for later. Ed worked for months without acting out. He got permission from his parole officer to live on his own, He got an apartment in Alameda, California. He got to feel some real freedom for the first time in his life. He even started looking for a girlfriend. He had some problems trying to meet a girl his own age. Part of that came from Ed's low self-esteem. The other part was just how he felt about women. Ed once said, quote, "When I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her home, be real nice, and treat her right. The other part wonders what her head would look like on a stick." End quote. Naturally, that would make getting to know a woman difficult. However, according to Ed, he did manage to meet a 16-year-old girl at a local high school. The two struck up a relationship. The girl's name is unknown, but she was just Ed's type. Blonde, petite, young, and immature. Her immaturity led to accepting Ed without asking too many questions, and he never expected to receive affection from a woman. Ed said he loved the girl, but they never had sex because he viewed her almost religiously. Regardless, the 21-year-old Ed and the 16-year-old girl got along well enough they actually got engaged. But Ed's mother, Clarnell, was disgusted. She couldn't believe he was dating someone so young. She began calling him, pestering him, telling him to leave the girl alone. She even began showing up on his doorstep to relay her disapproval in person. Ed couldn't take his mother's bereavement, and he broke up with his fiancée. He asked his mother to introduce him to someone his own age. His mother refused. She told Ed he was too much like his father, and he didn't deserve to meet any nice young women. Now Ed was even more furious at his mother, and desperately lonely. He retreated back into his fantasy world, where he began planning out intricate, sadistic, and sexual murders. He started pushing boundaries in real life. In 1971, when Ed was 22, he began driving around the Santa Cruz area, looking up to pick up female hitchhikers. Author's note: serial killers often follow a common pattern of escalation. They often practice, then will select their victims, way before ever hurting anybody. It is a build-up, and eventually there is a snap. Ed said he began picking up young women hitchhiking to learn how to talk to them. He said he figured out how to talk to them to gain their trust and get them into his car. He would purposely take wrong turns in secluded areas and tell them it was a mistake. He didn't know where he was. As Ed became better at charming women, he got closer to committing his sick fantasies. Over time, he built a stockpile of murder weapons in his trunk. He collected plastic bags for suffocating victims, hunting knives, and blankets to catch their blood, even handcuffs. He rigged the passenger side door of his vehicle so it wouldn't open from the inside. If a woman got in, she was trapped. Ed borrowed a 9mm from a friend, and he kept it under his seat. In 1972, when Ed was 23, he lost his job with the highway department. He hadn't been paying attention while working and would play hooky to go search for hitchhikers. After losing his job, Ed knew that he would soon run out of money, and if he ran out of money, he'd have to move back in with his mother. On May 7th, 1972, Ed had a particularly vicious conversation with his mother. Ed Kemper decided the next hitchhiker he picked up would be the first woman to visit Ed's vicious world. Ed cruised the California highways looking for a suitable victim, preferably a co-ed. Ed hated his mother so much, he wanted to spite her by association. His mother worked at a university, so he wanted to kill a university student. Around 4 p.m., Ed drove up to the California State University in Fresno. He spotted two petite young women with their thumbs up, looking for a ride. He asked them where they were headed, and they told him they needed a ride to Stanford University. He agreed to take them, and they got in the car. They were both 18, Mary Ann and Anita. They were college roommates. They just spent a few days visiting friends in the area. They decided to hitchhike home in order to meet new people. Ed quickly learned the two girls didn't know the area, and he took them all across the highway system, pulling loop-de-loops and throwing off their sense of direction. He showed them a radio transmitter he kept in his car while he was working for the highway department. The girls suggested that he was an undercover cop, which they believed might have been the real reason he had a radio transmitter. Ed told them he wasn't a cop, but they acted like they didn't believe him. He felt like their false belief that he was a cop helped them trust him. Instead of taking the women south to Stanford, he took them east to a small town called Livermore. The conversation between the three was pleasant and casual. Ed pulled into a rural and secluded cul-de-sac. He got out the 9mm from under his seat, and he pointed it at Mary Ann in the passenger seat, who reacted surprisingly calm. Anita was in the back seat, too terrified to move. Ed said later that he was also terrified. At the moment, this is the first point he'd pushed himself to the point of no return. He had lived in a world of fantasy, and now he had pulled a very real, very dangerous gun on two vulnerable young women. Ed knew there was no going back. Fantasies aside, if he wanted to avoid prison, he'd need to kill these women. By repeatedly imagining the act of murder, Ed conditioned himself to commit murder without caring about the possible long-term consequences. By spending years of dreaming about murder, it made it much more likely he would actually go through with murder. Of course, Mary Ann didn't know about his lifelong desire to destroy. When Ed pointed his gun at her, she immediately took on a tone of leadership and authority. Ed was shocked to see the change in her personality. He had assumed that she was a naive, trusting person. Mary Ann tried to de-escalate the situation. She cracked a joke and tried to speak sympathetically with Ed and told him that she was willing to talk through his problems. Initially, Ed said that he felt a certain level of reverence toward Mary Ann. Her deep blue eyes made an impression. He said he was really quite struck by her personality and her looks. But the more she spoke, the more he recognized what she was trying to do. Mary Ann's attempts to connect and reason with Ed were reminiscent of the psychiatry sessions he had sat in on. Ed remembered the serial rapist discussing their motives with the psychiatrist, and he remembered the stories of the victims that had managed to persuade their assailant not to harm them. Ed said that half of him was impressed with Mary Ann's competence and coolness, and the other half was infuriated. She was trying to resist him. He said that he was sure Mary Ann could have talked her way out of the clutches of a rapist, but Ed wasn't about to let that happen. According to a 1986 article written by the Behavioral Science Unit at the FBI, assailants operate with different motives. There's no guarantee you'll be able to talk your way out of anything. You might infuriate them. A 1992 study entitled Fighting Back: Women's Resistance to Rape found that women who responded with physical aggression, them fighting back, were more likely to avoid rape than women who did not resist such force. According to this study, responding to sexual violence with violence can only help your chances of escape. Of course, Ed Kemper wasn't looking to just rape these women. He was going to kill them. Ed pointed his gun and commanded that one of the girls get into the trunk. While Ed himself knew that he was going to kill these women, he wanted them to believe he was only going to rape them right up until the moment of their deaths. He told them he was going to drive them to his apartment, where they would go inside. He told them he wanted one in the trunk, so he only had to keep his eyes on one woman. Mary Ann continued to attempt to convince him to let him go, and Ed decided that Anita was the more easily controlled. He pointed the gun at her and commanded she walk back to the trunk with him. Ed handcuffed Mary Ann's arm and told her to attach herself to the seatbelt. Ed stuck the gun in Anita's face and made her walk back to the trunk. He grabbed a plastic bag and a knife and had Anita climb inside the trunk. Then he shut the lid. Walking back up to the passenger side of the car, he had noticed Mary Ann had not handcuffed herself like she was told. He pointed the gun in her face. He told things were to go badly for her and her friend if she didn't start following orders. Mary Ann complied now, convinced he was beyond the realm of reason. Ed reached out and grabbed Mary Ann's arms and handcuffed her behind her back. As he reached, he accidentally brushed his hand against one of her breasts. Ed said that he actually became embarrassed, blushing and apologizing, even saying, "Whoops, I'm sorry." Ed was surprised even by his own actions. Even when he was mapping out murdering women, he didn't know how to actually interact with them. Ed decided he would try to be clever with his first kill. He brought out the plastic bag and put it over Mary Ann's head. He forced her face down in the car seat. Mary Ann still didn't realize Ed was going to kill her. She protested, telling Ed she couldn't breathe with the bag on her head. He told Mary Ann that the bag was meant to muffle her voice, to keep people from hearing her. He slid the bag over her head and got excited. He pulled out a cloth rope from a bathrobe to tie around Mary Ann's neck. and to strangle her. He tightened his grasp and pulled too tight, and the rope snapped. Ed had failed at strangling Mary Ann with the rope, but he'd hoped the bag was doing its job. He turned Mary Ann's head, only to find out she'd chewed a hole in the bag. As forcefully as she could, Mary Ann told Ed she'd been suffocating. She told him if he didn't take the bag off her head, she would die. Ed was enraged by her resistance, as well as his own incompetence. He reached in his pocket and pulled out a switchblade. He stabbed her repeatedly before slitting her throat. Somewhat dazed by the experience, Ed knew he still had to kill the other girl. He walked to the trunk and popped it open, trying his best to keep his bloody hands concealed. Cowering, Anita asked Ed what had happened to Mary Ann. Ed told Anita, well, she was getting smart with me, and he showed Anita his hands. He tried to reassure her, saying that he'd only punched Mary Ann, giving her a bloody nose. Even after killing a woman, Ed still couldn't bear Anita knowing that he was a killer. He told Anita that she should get out of the trunk to help her friend. As she climbed out, Ed grabbed a large hunting knife called the Original Buffalo Skinner. He began stabbing Anita. Ed said that she fought valiantly, but she never really stood a chance against a 6'9" giant with a massive knife. Once Anita was dead, Ed hid both the bodies in his car. He got in his car and drove away, blood still on his hands. After driving by several people that gave him odd looks, Ed managed to get the girls back to his apartment. He proceeded to defile the bodies. He grabbed his Polaroid and took pornographic photos of their corpses. He decapitated them and proceeded to use their severed necks for sex. Ed was fixated on the idea of a woman's head without a body. To him, controlling a head without a body meant he had full control of the woman herself. In following interviews, he says he's not really sure when that particular fantasy started, but that a memory of his dad cutting off the head of a pet chicken might have been an early contributor. Once Ed was finished with the bodies, he butchered their corpses. This way, it'd be harder for the police to identify them. Ed put each body part into its own separate plastic bag and scattered them across the back roads. Ed later said the memory of Mary Ann and her blue eyes haunted him. She was the only person he claimed to ever have any real remorse for killing. He knew that she was the perpetual reminder if he had chosen a different path, a moral path. Perhaps he could have met some nice young lady and had his own children with deep blue eyes. He even went as far as to look at Mary Ann's driver's license to find out where she lived. He then would drive past the house, imagining the life he could have if he had been born to a different parent. But he'd already killed Mary Ann, and the only thing that could replace her was more victims. In August 1972, 2 months after he'd killed Mary Ann, hikers stumbled across Mary Ann's head. The police were able to identify her using dental records. They organized a search for the rest of her body and into any indications of where Anita might be, but they were unable to find any other pieces of the women. For about 4 months, Ed would hold back his murderous urges. However, still unemployed and his resources dwindling, he came closer and closer to having to move back in with his mother. Ed fantasized about killing. Again, he got his chance just after dark on September 14th, 1972. 23-year-old Ed Kemper spotted a young girl hitchhiking. She was at a bus stop. He stopped and asked her her name. The girl was 15-year-old Aiko Koo. She'd missed the bus to her dance practice and had no other way to get there. Aiko got into his car, and Ed made small talk as he drove off. This was to set her at ease. Aiko didn't suspect anything was wrong with Ed until he pulled into an entrance of a dark, deserted forest. He then pulled a gun out from under his seat. Ed had been thinking about his last kill and what had gone wrong. He felt he'd lost control of the situation near the end, and this time he wanted his victim to trust him until the very end. Ed recalled Aiko's panic, and he reassured her she wasn't in any danger, he told her. He said that he was horribly depressed, and they had planned to kidnap her and kill her too, then kill himself. However, he said that after talking with Aiko, he decided to spare her life. Now he just wanted someone to talk to. Aiko was naturally suspicious, but Ed's charm slowly brought down her defenses. Confident she wouldn't go anywhere, Ed got out of the car to get some tape out of his trunk. Aiko sat calmly in the passenger seat, waiting for Ed to get back and drive her home. Ed closed the trunk and returned to the driver's side door, only to find that he'd accidentally locked himself out. It was Ed's turn to panic. He'd accidentally saved his victim from himself. Aiko could have started the car and driven away at any moment. He knocked on the window, hoping that he had successfully convinced her he wasn't a real threat. Aiko realized Ed was locked out, and he was her kidnapper, but she'd believed that she had reached his troubled soul. She unlocked the door, and Ed got back into the car. It was a testament at how manipulative Ed could be. When she unlocked the door, Ed suffocated her until she was unconscious, raped her, then strangled her. Ed loaded Aiko's body into his trunk and admired the corpse. He put it like it was a fisherman admiring his catch. Ed took Aiko's corpse back to his apartment. He dismembered her, had sex with her body, much like his prior victims, and scattered Aiko's body across several deserted areas. Only a small number of her bones were ever found. On November 29, 1972, 1 month after killing Aiko, Ed met with his court-ordered psychiatrist. After a lengthy discussion, the psychiatrist deemed Ed to be officially cured, saying, quote, "If I were to see this patient without having any history available or any of his history from him, I would think that I was dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illnesses," end quote. At the urging of the psychiatrists, Ed Kemper's juvenile criminal record was expunged. The state believed Ed Kemper would never kill again, but he was already dreaming about his next opportunity to murder. In December 1972, when Ed was 24, financial pressure forced Ed to move back in with his mother. He purchased a .22 caliber pistol and went patrolling for his next victim. On January 7, 1973, Ed drove around the campus of Cabrillo College, a local community college. He spotted a hitchhiker and offered her a ride. The hitchhiker's name was Cindy Shaw. She was 18 years old, petite, pretty, exactly Ed Kemper's type. He followed the usual routine, driving his victim around in circles while luring her into a false sense of security. With charming conversation, he drove Cindy to a secluded area, pulled out his .22 caliber pistol, and shot Cindy in the head. She died instantly, but Ed wasn't done with her. He stuffed her body into his trunk, drove home. When his mother fell asleep, he brought Cindy's body into the house and hid her in the closet. He waited till his mother left for work the next day. He retrieved Cindy's body, had sex with her corpse, dismembered her, and threw her into the Pacific Ocean, all but her head. Over the next several days, he had sex with Cindy's head. When he was done with it, he played his own version of a sick joke. He buried Cindy's head in his backyard, with her face looking up toward her mother's bedroom. This made him laugh, because he knew that his mother always wanted people to look up to her. Even after killing 6 completely unrelated people, his mother was still the true target of his anger. The police retrieved Cindy's body from the ocean in less than 24 hours. They managed to piece her back together. The police decided a pattern was emerging. Female hitchhikers were being dismembered, and their body parts were scattered to the wind. The police finally realized a serial killer was roaming the streets. Unfortunately, they didn't have any leads. Ed Kemper was given the nickname by the media, the Co-Ed Killer and the Co-Ed Butcher. And Ed watched the news. The news spread, and colleges warned their students to stop hitchhiking. However, many of them didn't listen. For the next few months, Ed continued to pick up hitchhikers and wait for his opportunity to strike again. He remembered several of the women he picked up talking about the serial killer, asking him who he thought the serial killer was. Ed said that any time a woman brought up the serial killings, they got a free ride. He didn't explain why he would let these women go. He only said he couldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Essentially, when another person brought up Ed's actions, he felt shame from acting out his darkest impulses. This may also explain why he couldn't stand it when a victim suspected he was going to kill them before he actually did. The University of California, Santa Cruz advised students only to hitchhike in cars that possessed the official university parking stickers. Unfortunately, Clarnell worked at the university, and Ed had one on his car in case she needed to borrow it. On February 5th, 1973, Ed and Clarnell got into a particularly loud and ugly argument. Ed was furious, and he decided to vent his anger toward his mother by killing once again. Ed drove to the USC campus, where he picked up 2 more hitchhikers, 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Allison Liu. They were both college students at the university and the parking sticker effectively tricked them into thinking he was a safe ride. Ed was so bloodthirsty and angry at his mother, he simply couldn't wait to kill these two women. Without even stopping the car, he pulled out his .22 caliber pistol, shot Rosalind in the head at point-blank range, then opened fire on Allison in the back seat. Rosalind died immediately. Allison was mortally wounded. Ed pulled the car over and shot Allison once more in the head. He put the women's bodies in his trunk. Ed felt both invincible and invisible. He decided to flaunt his killing prowess by driving to his mother's home, opening the trunk, and decapitating the corpse right on the street. He said if his mother or his neighbors had looked out the window, he would have been caught right then and there. Unfortunately, nobody noticed. Instead of being caught, Ed just simply shut the trunk and left the bodies. In the morning, when his mother left for work, he brought in Alice's body and Rosalind's head. He removed the bullets from both of them, had sex with each, and dismembered them for disposal. He discarded the bullets so they couldn't be traced back to him. He scattered their body parts along the countryside near Santa Cruz. 1 week later, several body parts were found, but once again, there was no evidence linking Ed Kemper to the crime. The news was filled with speculation about the co-ed killer, and the area became even more fearful because Ed enjoyed the fact the police were nowhere near capturing him. It made him feel powerful and manly. While Ed was boosting his ego, another serial killer named Herbert Mullen was also active in the area. Herbert Mullen was an actual schizophrenic who killed 13 people at the behest of voices that he was hearing in his head. The combined killings of Ed and Herbert earned Santa Cruz the nickname the murder capital of the world. However, Ed Kemper's reign of terror was nearing its end. Between March and April of 1973, Ed slowly realized he'd gotten enough practice killing and that he could finally kill his real target, 52-year-old Clarnell Strandberg, his own mother. Ed said in an interview, quote, "I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her. She went out to a party, she got sauced, came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that. I came out and walked up to her bed. She's laying there, reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, 'Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk.' And I looked at her. Then I said, 'No.' I said goodnight. And I knew I was going to kill her." End quote. On April 20th, 1973, 24-year-old Ed grabbed a claw hammer and a knife. Then he waited until his mother fell asleep. He then went back into her room, slit her throat, and bludgeoned her to death. After years of fantasizing about killing his mother, simply taking her life to settle Ed's rage was not enough. He proceeded to commit several more depraved acts. They all symbolized some aspect of his anger toward her. Ed said that he did this to humiliate his mother, to shame her memory as much as he could, and show his mother exactly how much he hated her. Lastly, he destroyed her vocal cords. Ed said that this was his final attempt to truly shut her up. He had listened to her nagging for his entire life, so he tried to destroy her ability to speak. He hid her remains in the closet. Ed didn't want to go to prison, and he knew people would come looking for her. He decided he would skip town, perhaps even flee the country, but he needed to give himself as much time to flee as possible. He came up with what he thought was a clever plan. Ed knew that if his mother failed to come to work, people would immediately start looking for her. But if both her and her best friend failed to show up, their employers would think the two had gone on a trip. Clarnell and her best friend, 59-year-old Sarah Hallett, had been known to go on impromptu vacations every once in a while. It would be strange for them to be absent from work, but not unprecedented. Of course, in order for Ed's plan to succeed, Sarah Hallett would have to go missing along with his mother. Ed called Sarah and asked if she wanted to help him throw a surprise party for his mother. It would be a simple night, just him, Sarah, and his mother watching a movie together. Sarah took every chance she could to hang out with Clarnell, and she thought surprising Clarnell with a movie was a wonderful idea. When Sarah arrived, he invited her in. He lured her into a false sense of security, and then he strangled her. Ed decapitated Sarah's corpse and spent the night with her body. He hid the bodies in the closet and cleaned the apartment. Ed took all the money available to him and the keys to Sarah's car. He drove as fast as he could out of town, heading east across the United States. Over the next 3 days, Ed was paranoid the police were on his tail. He avoided major highways, sticking to back roads to lessen the chance of being spotted. He checked newspapers at every gas station. He kept looking for news about his mother's murder, but no news came out. Nobody had found the bodies. Ed's mind began to spiral into chaos. At any moment, her body could be found, and at any moment, he could become one of the most wanted men in America, constantly on the run. Given that he was 6 feet 9 inches tall, he decided he would stand out anywhere. His paranoia became too overwhelming, and he decided to put an end to all the running before the chase even began. In Pueblo, Colorado, he pulled up to a payphone and called the Santa Cruz Police Department. He told the officer who answered the phone that he'd killed his mother, and they could find her corpse in her closet. The officer that picked up the phone recognized Ed's voice. The two had been drinking buddies at the jury room. When Ed confessed, the officer thought Ed was joking and hung up the phone. Ed called again and asked to speak with a different officer. He confessed once more. The officer still didn't believe him, but this time they sent an officer to search the house. The police were shocked at the sight of Clarnell and Sarah's dismembered corpses. Ed told them he was in Pueblo, and the Santa Cruz police officer stayed on the phone with him. Ed waited patiently to be arrested by the Pueblo Police Department. Ed went with them willingly. During the car ride to the police station, he confessed to the other 6 murders that had earned him the nickname, the Co-Ed Killer. The police were stunned. They simply couldn't understand why such a heinous man would turn himself in. Ed told them that he had to stop himself. He said, quote, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time. Emotionally, I couldn't handle it much longer toward the end there. I started feeling the folly of the whole damn thing. At the point of near exhaustion, near collapse, I just said the hell with it and called it all off." End quote. The Co-Ed Killer had finally been caught. Ed's story swept the nation, and when it finally went to trial, everybody tuned in to hear the verdict. During the court proceedings, Ed got a hold of some razor blades and attempted to puncture an artery in his wrist. He was caught and saved from suicide. Then only a few days later, Ed attempted the same method of suicide again, and a jail guard managed to find Ed and keep him alive. Initially, it was said that he was suffering from emotional distress after killing his mother. Later, he said his suicide attempts were the result of antipsychotics that the court had prescribed him. On November 8, 1973, Ed Kemper was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder. He was given multiple sentences of life in prison. Instead of life in prison, he insisted that he be given the death penalty. However, California had put a moratorium on the death penalty, and Ed was kept alive once more. Ed returned to Tuscadero, and the suicide urges gradually went away. When it became clear to Ed that he was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars, he settled into his role as a prisoner. He looked for any opportunity to keep himself busy. One of his favorite prison activities was volunteering for a charity called the Blind Project, where Ed and other prisoners would record books on tape for the blind. Ed narrated the novelization of the original Star Wars trilogy. Ed became a model prisoner. He soon drew the attention of 2 men, Robert Ressler and John E. Douglas. John and Robert were special agents with the FBI in the Behavioral Science Unit. John E. Douglas became the first FBI agent to develop the idea of psychological profiling for criminals. He contacted Ed in the late 1970s, and the trio began a series of long-form interviews. Most of what we know from Ed Kemper came from those interviews. They were personal and extremely in-depth. Ed was an open book, and it appeared to John and Robert that he didn't just want to talk about the past, he needed to. After thorough fact-checking, John and Robert were surprised that most of what Ed had told them about his life was true. They'd interviewed serial killers before, but most of the killers they'd spoken to had a difficult time describing their past or telling the truth at all. John and Robert also took notice that Ed's genius IQ also contributed to his exceptional ability of introspection. John and Robert said that Ed seemed to have cracked most of his own psychological code. Ed's self-described motives for murder were unusually insightful and exceptionally helpful. When John and Robert ran into killers who didn't possess the intellect necessary to understand themselves, John and Robert were able to use Ed's psychological profile to dive deeper into what made them tick. Ed's mind became sort of a Rosetta Stone for the psychology of serial killers. Today, Ed Kemper is still alive and imprisoned at Tuscadero. The 72-year-old killer said that he's happy with his life behind bars. He's waived his right to a parole hearing every year, since nobody would ever let him out of prison, nor should they. He's managed to build a reputation as one of the friendliest prisoners at Atascadero. He has said on multiple occasions, if he were ever released, he would likely go right back to raping, killing, and dismembering women. This has been the Killer Bee True Crime Podcast, Episode 6, Ed Kemper, the Co-Ed Killer. Thank you for listening, and God bless.